our next instructor, next speaker, is Paige Harden. Paige is a psychologist who, not just a research psychologist, also has training as a clinical psychologist, which a fact that I love. And she is a leading researcher in social science genomics. She's done a lot of work both on the behavior genetics side and then also in recent years with molecular genetics. Also runs her own data set, or helped create her own data set, the Texas Twins Project, and so has expertise from lots of different angles. And she's recently been thinking about the social and political implications of social science genomics, and just published a book called The Genetic Lottery, which I'm very excited to read. And so we're very lucky to have Paige here with us. Thanks, Paige.
Okay, so I think we're all set up technically. Are your Zoom people, they can hear me okay?
I think so.
All right. I was telling Dan that I feel very rusty. It feels weird that we used to do this all the time, like stand up in front of strangers in a room. So what I'm going to try to do today is talk about just a history of using genetic data within the field of psychology, with an emphasis on talking about kind of three eras. The behavior genetic era, which we've already heard about from David, the candidate gene era, and why I think psychology was led astray down that path, and then where I think the possibilities are in our current era of modern molecular genomic techniques. And I want to give examples of sort of thinking like both a psychologist and a geneticist, and really trying to imagine the possibilities of what do psychologists bring to genetics that are different in terms of disciplinary perspective relative to sociologists or economists, and then what can psychologists bring back to their home discipline when they have access to genetic data sources. And the specific example I'm going to talk about is a recent study we just completed on externalizing behavior. Okay, so as we've already heard from David, the intellectual roots of almost everything that y'all are going to learn about in this workshop date to the early 20th century in terms of the work of Galton, Carl Pearson, and Ronald Fisher, who really redefined the study of heredity not as a field of biology, but as the nascent field of statistics and biostatistics. How can we study heredity by doing statistical analyses of resemblance between different types of relatives? So they were not psychologists. Psychology was a very new field, as were many of the fields that we define as disciplines today. But they did touch on what we would think of as psychological phenomena, and in particular, things like ratings of how well a student was doing in school, or when we imported into America the first intelligence tests from France, biological similarity between biological relatives in the measurement of so-called mental abilities. The fact that so much of the work that we do now is rooted in this early tradition, and given that many of the founders of the fields of behavior genetics and biostatistics also espoused eugenic views, is, I think, a major source of frustration and miscommunication and difficulties communicating what we do to people in our home disciplines of sociology, economics, and psychology. I wrote an essay about this last year called The Science of Terrible Men, which just talks a little bit about how can we communicate results that acknowledge the field's eugenic origins. I will say that I completely ripped this headline off from an essay by Emily Nussbaum, who's the television critic for The New Yorker, who wrote an excellent essay in her book I'd Like to Watch called What Do We Do with the Art of Terrible Men? And it was her grappling with being someone who really likes the work of Woody Allen. And I just really liked that essay of hers in terms of how she grappled with the ambiguity of thinking of something as valuable and how to communicate that value even when we recognize that it's coming from a place, from an artist, from a creator that we find problematic for various reasons. So what we would think of as genetic data in psychology, as a kind of modern psychology departments, was something that really came about in the post-World War II era. To just take two examples from intellectual grandfathers of mine, we have things like the instantiation of the beginning of the Texas Adoption Project. So this was started at the University of Texas, where they recruited moms who were in Texas homes for unwed mothers, where they'd been sent away from their families to have their illegitimate babies in privacy and in secrecy. And then those babies were adopted by non-biological relatives, usually much wealthier families. And so it was a study of what is the resemblance between these children and their biological moms who never raised them and their adoptive parents who were not genetically related to them. At the same time, we have people like Irv Gottesman who began looking overseas and noticing that Americans kept really bad records, but Europeans did a much better job. And that if we looked to, say, Denmark or Sweden, they kept enormous population records that could be used to estimate the similarity of different types of twins, or to look at the transmission of things in children of twins, which was one of his favorite designs and mine too. So this was an era of work, and I'm actually really glad that I'm going after David, because he's already described to me, the models that they were bringing to bear for these analyses. But this is a methodological approach that's really dominated, I think, by three historical trends. And the first is, at that time, they had no ability to measure the human genome directly, right? So John Lowland is starting the Texas Adoption Project 10, 15, 20 years after the discovery of the structure of DNA, but there's no way to look inside people's cells and actually read anything about it at that time. So they're trying to infer things entirely on the basis of patterns of phenotypic similarity between different types of relatives. The second is to think about what else was going on in psychology at that time. And this was a time in which psychology was newly dominated by experimental paradigms, more and more commonly with non-human animals. So we'd seen Thorndike's cats in puzzle boxes. We'd seen Skinner's rats in, or pigeons. We'd seen flying little rats over mazes to see if they could learn from looking at them rather than going through them. And an increasingly common paradigm at that time were two forms of animal research. And one was cross-breeding experiments, where you took, say, rat pups from their biological mom and they were reared by another dam, or the studies of inbred animals. So what you can see here is the psychologists looking at their colleagues who study non-human animals and saying, what can we do that's like that? Instead of a cross-breeding experiment, can we do an adoption study? Instead of measuring inbred animal strains, can we look at identical twins? So they're trying to borrow from the tools of experimental non-human animal research, but of course don't have all of that lovely experimental control that you have if you work with animals. Who here has ever done animal work? Okay, yeah, a little bit. So it's something that it's very common in training as a psychologist, but I think less common in training as an economist to ever have a rat that you have to train. The second thing that was happening in post-World War II psychology was the explosion of two fields, clinical psychology and IO psychology. So if you're thinking about what are the sorts of psychological and behavioral traits the psychologists are studying, they're studying things that are relevant for this nascent field of psychiatric diagnosis. So moving beyond our Freudian systems of classification to trying to separate out what is depression versus bipolar disorder. People are naming these things and coming up with diagnostic checklists. And also traits that are relevant for selection into occupations. So with the United States military is the greatest proponent of psychological testing that has ever existed on this planet. But it's not just the military. It was the growth of large firms that were interested in figuring out how can we select the best personnel. So you have this newfound applicability of psychology for real-world industries and medical diagnosis. And at the same time, you have this animal research envy that's happening. And these two things are coming together in twin and adoption studies of personality, of mental abilities, and of what we would now call psychopathology. So this research, I would say, and I'll get to this in a second, It was always contested, both methodologically in terms of the assumptions that it's made, and also ideologically in terms of how it was conscripted into political debates in America surrounding the civil rights movement. But I think that there's kind of 5 big findings from this era of behavioral genetic research, which might sound really obvious, but I think often have non-obvious implications for how we conduct the rest of social science research. The first one, which I think was quite a surprise when people were first doing these studies, is that living together and being raised by the same parents doesn't really make you psychologically all that similar to your siblings. So if we're looking at adopted sibling correlations for the broad domains, again, of personality, psychopathology, and mental ability, you see that people who are not genetically related to one another, by the time they reach adulthood, they're not really that similar to one another in those big 3 dimensions. The second is that this is true in terms of more genetically similar people are more psychologically similar for almost everything that people looked at. So when people were first doing adoption studies or twin studies, they thought they were going to categorize psychology and behavior into a camp of things that were heritable and a camp of things that weren't. And that turned out to be a false distinction. And so this is something that's been acknowledged for a long time. My own advisor is probably, Eric Turkheimer is probably most famous for what he called the first law of behavioral genetics, which is that everything is heritable. Which I think David walked through the implications of heritability really well earlier, which means that genes are often a difficult to measure but non-ignorable aspect of heterogeneity or differences between people. The third pretty consistent pattern that you see is that heritability is not overwhelmed by life experience, and in fact, heritability tends to get bigger as people get older. In my experience, in my kind of home field of developmental and clinical psychology, that's a counterintuitive finding for people. So oftentimes, psychologists think of, well, maybe genetic differences in biology matter a lot for temperament, or early babyhood, and that's kind of overwhelmed by accumulation of experience. But in fact, we see that genetically different people get more different as they move through their life, and genetically similar people get more similar as they move through their life. The fourth big finding is that genetic correlations among things that social scientists care about are the rule, not the exception. And we see evidence of this in twin studies that, let's say I have an adopted away identical twin that's high on X. Often that means that I'm going to be high on X, but also on Y and Z. And so this kind of genetic pleiotropy is something that we cared about a lot in twin studies, and also continues to bedevil our efforts to use genetics, even when we're moving into genomic data. And then fifth is probably just a way of restating one of the implications of the other 4 things, which is that most social and physical environments that children experience as they grow up are not happening to them imposed randomly. They can't reasonably be assumed to be exogenous to the genotype of the child or the genotype of his parents. So we're looking at a world as social scientists where everything is correlated with everything else, and we're really trying to be a causal science without all of that beautiful experimental control that we get when we raise our animals in a lab and we can control everything about their environment from the moment they're conceived. This makes our efforts to do good causal inference difficult because of this web of entwining between genes and environments. So as I said, those are kind of big findings, and I actually don't think that those are particularly controversial at this point in time. Yet, nonetheless, behavioral genetics was always an ideological battleground, and that is in many ways behavior geneticists' own fault, in the sense that in the UK, we've already heard this example of Eysenck saying, our efforts to redistribute income will always fail because income is heritable. In the US, with Art Jensen saying we'll never be able to boost in IQ or scholastic achievement in poor children or children of color, we might as well just give up. These behavior genetic findings about ubiquitous heritability were enlisted into people who were really opposed to many of the social reforms that were happening in the civil rights era in America. And so in many ways, the assumptions, the controversial mathematical and statistical assumptions that were necessary in order to make traction with behavioral genetics, because we can only observe the Ys, we couldn't observe the genetics, became not just controversial statistically, but also controversial ideologically. So people were fighting these ideological battles on methodological grounds. Eric, well, I'll just, three of the, you've already seen all of these quotes. I should have remembered that Dave and I like to quote the same examples from Goldberger and Jinks. So part of the backlash against the behavior genetics line of research really focused on oppositions to thinking of genes as deterministic, opposition to thinking of genes as a reductionistic level of analysis, that just because you saw genetic causes doesn't mean that the best way to understand a phenomenon is at this biological level of analysis. And this backlash to the ways in which behavior genetics was used to buttress sort of this naturalization of inequality, that inegalitarianism was sort of inevitable or natural. So Eric Turkheimer and I just summarized it this way, maybe, I don't know, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. Notwithstanding the thousands of twin studies that have been conducted and an equally rich history of theoretical writing on the subject, quantitative genetics, by which he means behavioral genetics in which you're inferring something about genetics based on patterns of similarity between relatives, but not necessarily measuring anything about someone's DNA, remains stubbornly controversial, both widely accepted as foundational, yet regularly rejected as misleading or worse. And I think this kind of dual we know and we don't know about behavioral genetics is really apparent if you're in a psychology department. If we're talking about something like schizophrenia or autism, it's considered completely matter of fact to say that, probably there's a heritable component to those diseases. Probably a child's individual biology matters for the etiology of who goes on to develop schizophrenia versus not. That just because we can see certain parenting patterns in the parents of schizophrenics doesn't mean that they're causing the development of schizophrenia. That's really considered very, very foundational. And it's coming from the same line of research that's rejected when it's applied to something like intelligence or educational attainment. So you have this kind of, I will accept some of it, but not all of it, sort of bifurcated response still within psychology to the field of behavior genetics. So largely during this time, there are examples of, some sociologists sort of being geno-curious, some economists being like, maybe we'll estimate the heritability of income. But by far the greatest concentration of people doing genetics as social scientists in this period of time, I think, was concentrated in psychology. And so you really had this sort of both inter and intra-disciplinary conflict, a minority of psychologists sort of in ideological conflict with the rest of their field, and a sociology being like very much a backlash against that, and most economists being like, we are steering clear of this nonsense, this mess. Okay, so that changed, I think, relatively quickly in the early 2000s with the ability to genotype people directly, and which we saw within psychology this rapid, albeit short-lived, embrace of the candidate gene paradigm. So I have on here a quote. When I was on the academic job market in 2008, 2009, someone at a university that will not be named asked me at my job talk, are you the last behavior geneticist? Are you the last person who's ever going to do a twin study or adoption study? Why would we do that when we can measure the serotonin transporter polymorphism directly now? And it's really striking to me how quickly people who had been critical of behavior genetics adopted this paradigm of measuring candidate genes and incorporating that into their research. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think one reason has to do with broader trends within psychology that we've faced now, or sort of begun to face up to with the replication crisis, in terms of lack of statistical power generally, the garden of forking paths, lack of pre-registration, lack of need for direct replication. But I also think that for a field that knew on one hand that biology mattered for behavior, but also was really, really skeptical of the ways in which behavior genetics was used ideologically and politically, candidate genes offered a really beautiful out to that dilemma, which was it seemed to give us sort of ubiquitous evidence for gene by environment interaction. We could easily measure a gene in a small sample of people and look, it was modified by childhood stress or childhood maltreatment or whatever. And that kind of seeming ubiquitousness of gene environment interaction, I think, seemed like the perfect way out of grappling with what behavior genetics was telling us about the relevance of genetics for behavior. And then, as we know, and I think as we'll talk about, y'all will learn about more in the last 2 weeks, that work ultimately kind of fell apart like a house of cards, and it seemed to be based on a lot of wrong assumptions about both the magnitude of effects that you were going to see from single genes, the number of people that you were going to need in order to have a replicable genetic association, and the ubiquitousness or lack thereof of moderation by common environments, such as stress. I think since then, psychologists have been gun shy. So we used to be, in many ways, the locus within the social science for adoption of genetic tools. And now I think we have fallen behind sociology and economics in a lot of ways because psychologists have been really slow to adopt modern genomic tools such as GWAS, genetic correlation, polygenic scores. What that means for y'all as students is that I think there's a ton of opportunity here to bring psychological concepts and tools, what do psychologists do well, into the social science genomics space, and to bring genetics back into answering psychological questions. Dan already touched on this in a way, which is, what is it about now that makes this such a promising moment? And I think there's 4 things that really have brought us to an exciting place for the synthesis of psychological questions and genomic data. The first is just the technological leaps have been astounding. I love that he showed that picture of how much it would have cost to sequence someone's genome 20 years ago, right? So we can now cheaply and non-invasively measure DNA in people for not that much money, compared to the cost, for instance, of doing a really good hormonal profile on someone, or training an investigator to go to a child's home and administer a good psychological test. The genotyping is the easy part now compared to so many of the other things that we are interested in measuring about participants. The second is scale. It is astounding to me that how matter-of-factly we can answer the question, well, typical studies now have between 100,000 and 1 million people. That is wild, right? Like, if you stop and think about it, that's totally wild that there have been that many people in such coordinated efforts that we now have access to data from private genomics companies, from national biobanks. As someone who collects my own data, I think it keeps me a little bit grounded on what an awesome resource it is to be able to go to a biobank and download data on 500,000 people. The third thing is collaboration, and I think this is something that's really important as a turn in psychology, because for so long we were a field that was dominated by this single investigator experimental paradigm. When I was on the job market and I was joining a very traditional psych department, they wanted to know, when I went up for my 3rd year review, which studies had data that had been collected at UT Austin. Not just was I the senior investigator on it, but was the data collected there, which is actually, I think, a really weird metric. But it was this intellectual holdover from how you showed independence from your mentors was around collecting your own little fiefdom of data in your own department. And I think genetics, by definition, is team science. And it's an international collaborative effort that gets away from this, lone genius with his little field that, that he's cultivating model of science. And I think that's a good thing. and there's so much more availability for students and trainees to collaborate, not just with your mentor, but across disciplines, across countries, across groups. And then the last thing is methods. Just thinking about the people in this room and what they have come up with in the last 5 years in terms of statistical methods, the rigor of that, and the rapidity of innovation, I think this makes it a really exciting time to be in this field. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of thinking about genetics like a psychologist, and then we're going to end up with how I think then I'm going to be able to take this back to my home discipline of psychology and hopefully answer some questions that are interesting to people who don't care about biology. And that example is externalizing. Okay, so who here has none of their degrees in psychology? So their undergrad degree is not in psychology, their graduate degree is not. Okay, so most of you. Okay, who here, keep your hands up, who here of those people could immediately give me a good working definition of the word externalizing?
I'm good.
Okay, so externalizing, so the first thing about why I think this is an example of treating genetic data thinking like a psychologist is that many people who are not trained as psychologists even know what the heck I'm talking about when I say the word externalizing, because it's a term that comes from child psychiatry. So in the, I think, what is this, 1966. So in the late 1960s, the child psychiatrist Thomas Achenbach is surveying this new field of child psychiatry where you diagnose children with individual things rather than just saying that they're all neurotic. And then he's noticing that they're coming up with these classificatory boxes for children. These children have conduct disorder, these children have ADHD, these children have oppositional defiant disorder, these teenagers have what we would now call an alcohol use disorder. And he's saying, well, one problem with these boxes is that the children who are in them are often the same kids. So kids who have ADHD also have conduct disorder. And kids who have ADHD and conduct disorder are more likely to have alcohol use disorder as an adolescent. And kids who have alcohol use disorder as an adolescent are more likely to be incarcerated as adults, or diagnosed with psychopathy, or diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. So can we think of a syndrome, can we think of a dimension which is not being depressed and anxious, but in fact causing lots of problems for your parents, for your teachers, for the authority figures in your life? And so he came up with this distinction between internalizing, which is problems manifested internally. I'm really sad and mopey and anxious and worry all the time, versus I have problems with my external environment. I am constantly in conflict with authority. This externalizing concept has continued to be investigated within psychology and behavioral genetics for several decades. Bob Kruger at the University of Minnesota is someone who's done a lot of this research looking at, well, there's not just this, what developmental psychologists would call heterotypic continuity. There's not just this continuity of you have this diagnosis in childhood and these problems in adolescence and these problems in adulthood, but also these things tend to co-occur within families. So parents who have a drug addiction are more likely to have children with ADHD. Identical twins who have an opioid addiction are more likely to have co-twins who are in trouble with the law for non-substance related reasons, suggesting that these things are not just comorbid with one another, but they share a genetic basis. So what we thought we could do is leverage that idea that these things, which many disciplines tend to study separately and in isolation, the idea that they have a shared genetic etiology, can we use that to more rapidly identify specific genetic variants associated with a number of these different phenotypes? There's been a lot of work interested in finding genetic variants associated with some externalizing traits. And in particular, in the wake of the opioid use epidemic, there's been increasing efforts at trying to identify genes that are associated with risk for opioid use disorders. But there's some real challenges to that work. One I mentioned is that psychologists think of externalizing as transcending these disciplinary boundaries, but most GWASs are focused on single disorders or single behaviors. So it's a GWAS of antisocial behavior, or a GWAS of opioid use disorder, or a GWAS of ADHD in childhood, but not thinking about what genes are in common across those things. And often for the more serious manifestations of externalizing, such as involvement in antisocial behavior, collecting genetic data involves collecting genetic data on the sorts of people who are not in UK Biobank, for instance, right? So we're talking about imprisoned populations, that's a sensitive population. So the net result of this is there's often insufficient sample sizes for any one phenotype to really advance discovery in terms of identifying specific genetic variants. All right, does someone have their bag with great sample size comes great replicability? Well, if you don't have sample size, you don't have replicable associations. Okay. So we're capitalizing on two things in this study. And the first is thinking of these not as individual silos, but as all part of a larger spectrum or dimension, which we think of as externalizing, which we hypothesize have some common genetic etiology. And the second is that that externalizing spectrum spans very serious behavior that might be difficult to phenotype because it involves collecting data on marginalized or vulnerable populations, but also stands what we think of as totally normal range variation of behavior that we can easily assess in surveys. So my graduate work was on relationships between delinquency and antisocial behavior and timing of fertility behavior. And it might be difficult to assess how much someone has been involved in crime, but it's not actually that hard to assess when someone first had sexual intercourse. You just ask them, at what age did you have sexual intercourse? So what we decided to do is identify externalizing relevant phenotypes for which we had at least 50,000 people. This is what we came up with. ADHD in childhood, problematic alcohol use, lifetime cannabis use, age at first sex, number of sexual partners, general risk tolerance, which is that one item thing from UK Biobank, are you the sort of person who likes to take risks, and lifetime smoking initiation. And what's notable about these is that depending on your disciplinary perspective, these do not go together at all, or these are obviously all manifestations of the externalizing spectrum, which is how we were thinking about them. So what we then did is we used LD score correlation to talk about, to estimate the genetic correlations using the GWAS data for these 7 phenotypes. I will just say here, I'm not going to explain the math of anything that I'm about to tell you, because that's what you're here for the 2 weeks, and I only have 40 minutes. So I'm just going to throw out names of things in the hopes that I was told by Dan that this could totally function as like an appetizer course for the rest of the institute. So I just am going to say LD score correlation to estimate the genetic correlations between these 7 phenotypes. In the same way that I think we get blasé about the sample sizes in genomics, oh, it's 1.1 million people. I think we get blasé about that's kind of like a bananas thing to be able to do, which is to estimate the correlation between 2 things that were not necessarily ever measured in the same sample. Like that kind of still feels like magic to me. So in this case, we just have GWAS results for these 7 phenotypes, and we're using LD score correlation to estimate what is the genetic correlation between these things. And then because I'm doing this project with Philip Collinger, who's an economist, but also Danielle Dick, who's a fellow psychologist. And because we're psychologists, we have never met a correlation matrix that we did not immediately want to factor analyze. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're using the genetic covariance matrix as estimated from the GWAS results of every of the 7 phenotypes to estimate a latent factor of externalizing, and then estimate what are the SNP associations with that latent factor. And this was using a technique called genomic structural equation modeling. Elliot Tucker-Draub will be here next week to describe this. I think y'all are also going to talk about other multivariate methods also, which is, okay, now that we have this wealth of genetic data on lots of things, how do we leverage the fact that these phenotypes we're interested in don't exist in silos? How do we take advantage of the genetic sharing amongst different things we're interested in? So in this case, we're estimating SNP associations not just with smoking, not just with age of first sex, not just with number of sexual partners, but with this inferred cross-cutting liability to externalizing disorders. This turns out to work really well. This is a lovely result compared to the results of previous results of these individual behaviors. So we end up with around 579 hits for this cross-cutting liability to externalizing. I'm not that interested in any one particular hit. I'm interested in then what can we do with those GWAS results for externalizing. So the first thing we can do is more genetic correlations. What are other GWAS phenotypes that exist in the ether where we can say, okay, we've done this GWAS of a general cross-cutting liability to problems with self-regulation and getting yourself in trouble over the course of the lifespan. What else is that genetically correlated with? And there's a couple things I want to call your attention to. So the first is when we're looking at other substance use phenotypes, it's working relievingly kind of the way we would expect it to, where we have the highest genetic correlations with other GWASs of drug exposure and cannabis use disorder. When we're looking at the psychopathology domain, our highest genetic correlations are with antisocial behavior, so a persistent pattern of failing to follow rules and laws, and suicide attempt, which is another impulsive behavior that's actually more common in people who have externalizing disorders than who have internalizing disorders. It's genetically correlated with GWASs of self-reported impulsivity. It doesn't seem to be just recapitulating low EA or low income, but we do see this markedly high genetic correlation with Townsend index, which is neighborhood deprivation, which I think if you've been thinking about research questions should set your little dinger bells off, which is how do we make sense of this genetic correlation that we're seeing between externalizing and neighborhood deprivation. We can also use those GWAS results for general externalizing to compute polygenic indexes in new samples of participants, and we did that in the AdHealth sample, which many of you are familiar with and you'll work with this week, and the COGA sample, the collaborative study of the genetics of alcoholism, which is a high-risk sample where at least one member of a family has an alcohol use disorder or other substance use disorder. And what we're doing, this is just a sample of the polygenic score analyses we're doing, is the first is we recapitulate that externalizing factor in AdHealth, and we see that it is accounting for around 10% of the variance of that in AdHealth. And then we also look at it in relation to a number of more serious disorders, including opioid use disorder and lifetime opioid use. Thinking about this in terms of quintile of polygenic score, we're showing that even though we're not putting anything about opiate drugs into the discovery model, our GWAS was not of opiates, right? It was of what age did you lose your virginity and did you have ADHD as a child. Our polygenic score is capturing meaningful variance in whether or not someone ever has a moderate to severe alcohol use disorder, if they've ever used opiate drugs or other forms of illicit drugs, if they've ever been arrested, if they've ever been convicted of a felony, and if they meet clinical criteria for 3 symptoms of antisocial personality disorder or conduct disorder in adolescence or adulthood. It is predicting college completion, whether or not you waited to have first sexual intercourse after 18. And this is, I think, interesting for maybe the economists in the audience, whether or not you've ever been fired from work before. We then took this polygenic score into BioView, which is a repository of electronic medical records in about 66,000 genotyped participants. And we looked at what electronically coded medical conditions were significantly associated with high externalizing. This is hard to see, for which I apologize. I just want to call out a few because I think it makes intuitive sense when you think about what biomedical conditions pop here. So chronic airway obstruction, bronchitis, respiratory failure, ischemic heart disease, protein calorie malnutrition, that's a complication of alcoholism, viral hepatitis, HIV infection, cancer of the bronchus lung, okay? So what we're seeing is we've done a GWAS of normal range variation in what we think of as externalizing relevant traits. It predicts more serious substance use and problems with employment and problems with involvement with the criminal justice system. And it also is associated with variation in medical conditions that have clear behavioral risks to them, such as complications from alcoholism, complications from smoking. Okay, so we like this paper. It's going to come out in Nature Neuroscience, I think, in 2 weeks. And I think it speaks to the power of going back to Ted's question earlier. As psychologists, often we're interested in our special phenotypes, right? Like our good, carefully curated measurements of things that we think are really core to the psychological constructs that are near and dear to our hearts. And when you're surveying the GWAS world, it's often like, well, how is what I'm interested in map onto these coarser phenotypes, with these kind of like I don't know what economist came up with the question, are you the sort of person who likes to take risks? But like what is that question, right? Like from a measurement perspective, it seems like such a strange thing. How can you take what's available in the large GWAS world and think about triangulating on what construct is of interest to you from a psychological behavioral perspective? And that was the challenge in this paper, which is what kind of made it a fun problem to work on. Our genetic correlations and polygenic associations highlight really a number of varieties of human suffering associated with these genes. We're talking about everything from biomedical conditions to suicidality to involvement with the criminal justice system. And we don't know why or how those genes are associated, but we are looking at a pattern of difficulty functioning in multiple domains. And I also think it really underscores that there's no clear boundary between biomedical genetics and psychiatric genetics and social and behavioral genetics in a world in which so many of the risk factors for biomedical conditions are behavioral, and those behavioral risks are stratified by social opportunity and power. Like there's no way to divvy up that pie in a really, really neat way. So all of this was me being interested in the genetic data, thinking like a psychologist, but then how do we bring this back to answer more psychological questions? And we are just beginning to think about this work, but some examples of thinking about going from GWAS to social science. Here are some potential directions. The first is causal effects. I haven't said anything about causal effects, right? We've come up with associations, but to what extent are these associations reflecting that hypothesized, if I had a magic wand and I could modify those SNPs at conception, what effect would that have on your life, on your behavior, on your biomedical condition, on your risk from being fired from work? We don't know that. The second, the intergenerational transmission of externalizing behaviors. This is a classic in sociology and psychology, right? Like, why do parents who have involvement with the criminal justice system, are they more likely to have kids who are involved with the criminal justice system and who have ADHD and are at risk for alcohol use disorders? I don't think that that is a purely genetic intergenerational transmission, but identifying clearly those social and environmental mechanisms is hard in a world in which everything is correlated with everything else. So can these GWAS results be a jumping off point to identify those environmental mechanisms of transmission? If you think about opioid use, alcohol, complications from alcoholism, suicidality, what do we have? We have the current epidemic of deaths of despair that affect non-college educated whites in America, right? Like those are the causes of death that have caused average lifespan in America to go down even before the coronavirus pandemic. We've seen clear cohort differences and education differences in risk for those biobehavioral and biomedical outcomes. So could we use this as a tool to think about shifting vulnerabilities? How does historical context, how does economic policy regimes, how do new things that are introduced in the policy landscape affect people who we are assessing to be at higher risk for those outcomes? The early development of externalizing. Okay, so we're looking at ADHD. By the time someone's diagnosed with ADHD, they're already 7, 8, 9, 10. What do they look like in infancy? What are their interactions and early caregiving relationships look like? What is their early patterns of brain development? This is another thing about what about our specialized niche phenotypes? Not thinking about how can I find a GWAS that matches the exact thing I want to measure, but how can I think of a GWAS result and then bringing that back into my boutique sample where I've looked at white matter connectivity in the first 3 years of life relative to the genetics of externalizing. And then finally, what everyone is interested in psychology, which is intervention effects. So a ton of my colleagues do school-based interventions for substance use, or for family interventions for ADHD, or anti-bullying interventions for aggressive behavior. Are those affecting everyone the same way? Are those a rich get richer effect, or is this potentially serving people who are most genetically at risk for those poor outcomes? And I think that's a wide open field of research when it comes to family and psychological therapies for addiction and aggressive behavior. Okay. The externalizing study I did not do alone. Is a very large effort with particularly Travis Mallard and Richard Linner doing a ton of the analytic heavy lifting. And yes, I will end with my shameless self-promotion, which is that my book's coming out at the end of next month. It is designed to be accessible to undergraduates. So if any of you are teaching and you are interested in thinking about it as an assignment for class, I have a mechanism to give free books for students for whom buying books is a financial hardship, and I can also send you copies to look at if you're interested. Okay, I will end there. I don't know how I did on time.
Perfect.
But, okay. Yeah.
Ivan was asking on Zoom if the summary statistics for the externalizing GWAS and Polygenic score will be available.
They will be available immediately upon publication of the paper, which is very, very soon, and you can just email me. So, yeah.
So I have one question. Could you go back to the correlation matrix?
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, how did you get the diagonal cells correlation? Because
I think those are the SNP heritabilities.
One or something, so then,
I believe what's on the diagonal is the SNP heritabilities, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, those are the SNP heritabilities. Sorry, I should have clarified that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the answer.
Those are the SNP heritabilities on the diagonal.
Oh.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
First of all, incredible work. I'm always very fascinated when it's a multidisciplinary group of researchers getting together, so I'm interested about the process. Was that you were interested in externalizing and you went to GWAS data to look for something that will explain it, or was the process reversed? Can you tell us a bit more about it?
It was interesting. So Danielle Dick, who is a psychologist and is also a co-investigator on the KOGA project, had heard a presentation by these guys on MTAG and approached Philip about the idea of using MTAG to boost discovery for alcohol use disorders. And then he was like, I don't actually know anything about alcohol use disorders or substance use or psychology, and he asked me for just like a crash course in it. And then one thing that came up is we wondered if MTAG was appropriate, given that the correlations between some of these are not, they're moderate, but they're not super high. And at the same time, Elliot Tagodrab, who's at UT, and Michelle Navard, who's in Amsterdam with Philip, were both independently working on something related to factor analysis models and GWAS data. And so they decided to work together and decided that our project was like a perfect sort of application for the thing they were developing. And then all of that then just like strung out for the next 4 years. And that's kind of how it came together. Yeah.
So, I mean, I buy this. But,
not everyone does.
but I'm also coming from sociology, so, different ways of maybe thinking about things.
Yeah.
So there's this paper in sociology that's a very cool title, Why Liberals Drink Lattes. It's about behavioral correlations among people who identify as liberals
Yeah.
and Republicans. The explanation there is that there are network effects, there are different network clusters, people
Yeah.
get exposed to different things. As I'm thinking about particularly externalizing behaviors, I'm thinking about people who are on the margins of society,
Yeah.
and clustered together. Well, why should we not think that that is a plausible explanation?
I don't think we shouldn't think that's a plausible explanation. I think what's key, and this is picking up on, I think, that very important distinction that Dan was making this morning about gene environment correlations, and how a correlation that an association between gene and phenotype that arises via some social process, but a social process that originates in something about the biology of the individual leading to selection into a certain social environment, and then social biases and things that we could think of as like possibly being different in a different construction of society happening to them would still be wrapped up in that causal effect of the gene. In the same way, David's example of like genes that affect your diet, but the environment is the food that you're putting in your body. So I don't think of a shared biology of externalizing in a shared social process by which people are conscripted into an underclass, or people develop an identity. Like, I'm thinking of that classic essay, like How to Become a Marijuana Smoker, where it's like you learn, you are entrained, and everything we know about conduct disorder and delinquency is the ways in which you are entrained in certain behaviors, right? Like, this is why you shouldn't take all the delinquents out of your school and put them in alternative schools where they learn from each other on how to be antisocial, right? But if what gets you into that process, into that initial social selection, is differentially associated with a genetically influenced temperament, whether that be sensation seeking, whether that be inattention, whether that be, then that social inscription can be part of the genetic effect. And I think that's a really key, like, I think that's a profoundly unintuitive but really key part to understanding what I think, at least I mean when I'm talking about genetic effects or shared genetic etiology, is that it can include those shared social processes. Would you, I'm looking at you because I'm like piggybacking on what you're saying as if I'm saying another version of it, but I just want to check that you would agree with that as a,
yes.
Okay.
I have a question about the G-Law structural equation model. So sometimes when I think about structural equation modeling, I think about invariance and how sometimes it can be really hard to do, especially as a developmental scientist, because of how certain things that are measured among children don't exactly apply or can be achieved invariant if you compare them with adolescents.
Yeah.
So I wonder to what degree this can be invariant, externalizing symptoms, this GWAS structural equation length variable could be invariant across different developmental ages. Like, is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think of invariance, I think of just to back up one step, is like, I think we should avoid in any discussions about factor models, avoid reifying it. It is a statistical entity that is a stand-in for a pattern of covariation, and whether that covariation exists only at a level of social analysis versus at some underlying biological level analysis. This data is agnostic about, and we can't know that. And we also don't know to what extent that pattern of covariation we would see in a different population, or if the measures were defined, or even if we included different phenotypes in the model, right? Like, if this is the centroid of a phenotypic space, if we add different markers of externalizing to it, right? The centroid of that space is going to change. The meaning of that's going to change. So I would avoid saying, like, I mean, this is always a problem when people talk about like G or general intelligence, right? It's like reifying this factor, and I don't want to do that here. It's amongst these samples, which is predominantly UK Biobank and 23andMe, right? So, you know, late 20th century, early 21st century, white people in the UK and the US, like this is the pattern of covariation that we see. I've done other work a while ago, just in twins, like in ad health, where you see, for instance, the relationship between fertility behaviors and antisocial behaviors are different when you're looking at black adolescents versus white adolescents. So what you see is that early fertility behaviors amongst black adolescents are much less correlated with involvement in antisocial behavior and with childhood ADHD. And you can think of reasons why. There's like cultural and economic differences in, you know, how we prescribe certain fertility relevant behaviors that fall across racial lines. And so you might see a different kind of externalizing constellation. I wouldn't necessarily say that early age at first sexual intercourse has the same meaning in terms of it tapping into a genetic etiology when we move away from this particular population in this particular point in time. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Questions are good. I love questions.
Given that we know that in the population these behaviors overlap, so our ability to discover an underlying common factor only relies on the variation, right? If there isn't any variation among the people who occupy these positive.
If there isn't any variation, or if there's any covariation?
Well, if there isn't, we want there to not be some overlap, right?
So genomics, then you can use like overlapping samples in it. So there's a different, yeah.
Not the samples, but just the types of, like, what we want is for these individuals to not essentially be the same individuals. Like, it doesn't.
Not necessarily. So I think So what you see in practice, I mean, the reason why people originally investigated the genetic correlations between these behaviors is because you see that you see the phenotypic correlations, right? You see the patterns of comorbidity within individuals. You don't need to have measured all these behaviors in the same individuals in order to estimate genetic correlations.
That is true,
yeah.
But if it is the case that in your population, 100% of the time, people who are, say, yes on the first factor, like say, are diagnosed with ADHD, are also diagnosed, like also have autosomal, then you can't really tell what if it is genetic or not, right? Like, because, or like if both factors are genetic, or if they're just, one is genetic and the other is just culturally associated with that.
I don't think I'm totally understanding your question, but I also think buried in your question is, again, this kind of wrong idea about what it means for things to be socially correlated versus biologically correlated. But I think what I'd rather do, if you don't mind, is try to hash that out between the two of us, because I think with some iteration I could understand your question better.
You guys planning on an internalizing GWAS?
People kind of have done it, right? The subjective well-being spectrum or well-being spectrum is really kind of an internalizing GWAS. So, all right, I'm going to stop talking now.